Let's do this bitch. It's weird being in this room again with the bright pink carpet, empty walls that don't have my posters on it, and this corner I'm sitting where my bed used to be. My dad listening to CNN way too loud, so I have to try and talk over that. It's where all my early videos used to be filmed when I still lived with him. Today I'm going to be doing another pattern. I'm going to go over the pattern and at least the confusing processes I had working with this pattern, and then of course review it in the end with a grade. But this will be the second, third, and fourth episode of this series because I am making this Victorian dress divided into basically the coat, the bodice, and the skirt because I don't want this video to be super long. So basically this is going to be Simplicity's pattern 2172. They call Misses Costume. My brain just blinked like always when I turn the camera on. So I don't think this is historically accurate. In fact, I think if anything, this is supposed to be for a steampunk costume. The reason why I'm making this is because I live in Southern California and every single year I go to the Renaissance Fair in the Santa Fe Dam. But like last year, I don't think that's happening again because of COVID, but that doesn't mean I don't want to make my costume for the future. And I know the Renaissance and the Victorian are two separate eras. They have a steampunk day at the Ren Fair and they have a time traveler's day at the Ren Fair. So I probably would wear this costume to either one of those weekends. So just clear it up. I know history, I have my degree in English. I know those are two very different periods of writing and history. So I'm gonna be that in between, more of like I'm a time traveler who traveled to the past, so is using modern techniques, but who traveled to the Victorian steampunk era. So that's kind of what I'm going for. Now we're gonna get into materials. So I brought this reusable grocery bag with me to my dad's house. The first material is, of course, the pattern. And then on top I just have stuff I need to help me cut it out. Okay, so I have the main fabric for the dress. It's 100% cotton. It's from Joann's and it was just in my closet. Basically, the main fabric is going to be this cute striped slash floral fabric. Down here is where you have to see if you need interfacing. So yeah, make sure to keep that in mind with your patterns. Sometimes they don't tell you everything you need up here. You have to look below to see if you need interfacing. 1 yard, so I'm probably gonna have to go get more interfacing. Right now for the coat, I have some interfacing, and this isn't the fusible interfacing. This is just more of a woven interfacing. This is not going to be the complete materials list. Just a warning, I'm recording this in my old room at my dad's house, and there is nothing literally but a desk and a chair in here, so this voiceover is going to sound echoey. So the other materials I will be using is this blue cotton fabric for the liner, for the cuffs and the collar. The pattern calls for organza silk, and you can bet my local Joann's did not have that. So I had to go with this sheer polyester, which any sewer knows is a nightmare to work with. I also got from Joann's these cool steampunk buttons. The buttons the pattern calls for are 7/8, but these buttons are bigger than that. And then this last item was not required. It is a blue ribbon. You will see why I decided to go with a blue ribbon instead of what the pattern called for. Kind of go rogue quite a bit for this pattern, so well, let's get into that. The process of pinning and cutting the pattern took 2 days because this pattern is 24 pieces. Let's just put that into a little perspective. There are some pieces that only require you to cut out one. However, there are many that require you to cut out 2 pieces, and in some cases 4, and then they're also putting into account the pieces that require liner and the pieces that require interfacing. So after reflection and looking at the pattern, I think I approximately cut 100 pieces, give or take, for this pattern. And this is not a pattern where you have option A, B, or C. No, you need all 24 pieces to create this entire garment. So just keep that in mind if you want to use this pattern. There is going to be a lot of cutting, and if you're like me, a lot of back pain. So the pieces I will need for the coat are 1 through 14. Keeping in mind that piece 6, coat back, and piece 7, coat side back, also need liner to be cut out. And we'll need 4 pieces cut out of the coat front and shoulder fling for the front and facing. There's also 1 piece, the coat liner, that does not require the main fabric. A mistake I made, even though it clearly says lining on it, use my main fabric on it. The coat is the smallest amount of interfacing you will need for this entire dress. This piece of the pattern, which is pattern piece 2, also has the lines of where the buttons will go. I kept running into problems when cutting this pattern. Cut the fabric the wrong way because the fabric is a turn over one direction layout. Trying to figure out what the heck a sleeve fling was. After talking to my partner's mom, who is also a crafter, turns out it's this part of the coat. So yeah, like I said, this whole process took 2 days of cutting. Mind you that I did cut out most of the pieces during this process. I just wanted to get all the cutting out of the way, despite that almost killing my back in the end. So getting into directions. If you're wondering, the seam allowance for this garment is 5/8 or 1.5 centimeters. Also, with patterns like these that also have liner, they also give you a fabric key of which shades mean main fabric right side and wrong side, liner right side, and interfacing. So make sure to follow those keys. So like I said, there is a lot of freaking pieces in this pattern. And looking at directions, I found it annoying that the pictures did not provide reference numbers to which pieces they were talking about in the instructions, especially when the pieces have long names like coat, upper, side, front, and pocket, and then they place it next to another and it's just confusing the hell out of my dyslexia. Like, how hard would it have been to add a number at least in the picture? Anyways, pieces 6 and 3 need to be stay stitched at 1.5 or 1.3 centimeters. And the reason the directions give for this is to prevent stretching on curved edges, which is actually really important because too much stretching not only affects the silhouette and the fit of your garment, but stretching can also become loose and make your stitches fall out, so I always make sure to stay stitched. In step 2, you apply the interfacing to the coat front. I'm actually not sure if they did want me to use iron-on interfacing, but I just pinned it in for now because I knew it would eventually be stitched in with the seam. They also instruct you to stitch a line at 1/2 stitch allowance between the dots. They did not call it a stay stitch, so I was not sure what it was for. I later realized it was a guide stitch for you when you sewed this piece onto the coat. So with steps 3 through 6 that had to deal with coat upper side pocket, coat lower side front, and coat facing, was a little confusing to me. So after I matched and sewed the pieces of facing and lower coat side front edge between the dots, once again, some numbers on these pictures would have been freaking helpful. I turned out the pockets right side out, and then for the next steps, I was not sure what they wanted me to do with it until I stepped away from it for a couple of days. What they wanted me to do and how I'm going to say this next sentence is going to be a little wordy and confusing. I eventually realized they wanted me to sew the bottom of the pocket facing to the bottom of upper front side and pocket. Like I said, confusing. And then I realized I needed to fold the upper lower cup front to create the pockets and pin down the edge of the pattern pieces because it is just a fancy pocket edge. It creates an illusion that the side front is one piece with a pocket. By the way, for these next steps, make sure not to catch the pocket edges when you're sewing the seams on the coat. And I'll get into a little bit more of how I did eventually think I needed to keep them down in some way so they weren't just flapping up and down. Temporarily baste the sides. Next is sewing the coat front to the side of the new front piece, making sure to match the dots and attach to the correct side. I always use the armhole as a guide. Step 8 is sewing the back pieces together, and honestly, it is the easiest step in this whole process. Also, because I'm a 90s kid, I had to put it on my back and pretend I was some sort of flower superhero. For step 9, which is the loops, I kind of went rogue by straying away from the directions. I tried doing the method of folding the small pattern piece that was provided to cut out the fabric and using a needle to pull it through. It was just not working out. So what I ended up doing was actually acting like the pattern piece wanted me to cut, unfold, and cut a piece of fabric that was the width of the pattern so that it was big enough to do sewing hack with a safety pin and turn it right side out. And then I cut it into 12 pieces. Then I used the pattern as a guide to see where to place it. After placing it and sewing on the side edges, it did come out slightly uneven, but I think that was because I made the mistake of marking the pattern after I took the pattern piece off and sewed things together, and not while I was cutting them, even not because the loops were slightly bigger. Next time, I'll probably just use a ribbon that matches the fabric because that seems less complicated to me. Step 13 is simple. You just need to sew the back, side, and side fronts together and the top shoulder seams. And then I want you to work on the liner. And what the heck is this? How is this helpful? I'm sorry, I guess it's just because I'm a visual learner, but I would like to have the directions for the liner evenly spaced out on how each piece sews to each piece. I know they're doing this to save paper, and you can somewhat use the directions for the main coat to create the liner. However, there is a new piece when it comes to the liner, piece 10, coat side front lining. So hopefully you find this picture I created helpful, how all 6 pieces are supposed to be sewn together. So first I sewed the 2 back pieces together, which is pieces 6 of lining, and then I sewed the side back linings, piece 7 to the sides of piece 6, and then sewed piece 10 to the sides of piece 7. Lastly, you put on the coat front that of course you have not already used that doesn't have the interfacing on it. The shoulder seams were the last thing I sewed together because I wanted to make sure that I got the shape right, which I did, so yay! Then you pin together the main coat to the liner matching the seams, sew it together, leaving a hole open at the bottom of the jacket for when you turn it right side out. I made sure to do the clipping where the pattern indicated because this really helps with the curves of my garment. And then there's step 16, and it has another unhelpful picture. I have no idea what this is referring to. Like, geez, zoom out. There is plenty of space below this picture to make it easier to indicate which part of the pattern you're talking about that I need to understitch. I'm going to be honest, I skipped step 16 because I could not figure out what part of the garment they were referring to, which might be why the coat turned out puffy in some places. So after I turned the coat right side out, I slip stitched the hole. I could have made the hole smaller and it wouldn't have taken as long to stitch it together. I ran into problems turning something out in the past when the hole was too small. That's what she said. So I made the hole bigger. I went over how to do a slip stitch in my last video, so if you want to check out how to do that, check out that video. I know I should have used thread that matched the fabric, but honestly I have 3 different shades of blue and white and tannish color stripes, so I just went for white thread. It's fine, it's fine, it's fine. For steps 18 and 19, for the sleeve fling, stitching it together right side to right side was not hard. For steps 18 and 19 for the sleeve fling. For steps 18 and 19 for the sleeve fling, clipping and trimming the seam allowance, I was just not too sure for the next steps, which was the understitching. I wasn't sure if they wanted me to do the stitching on the right side or the wrong side. After watching videos about understitching and facing, I realized they wanted me to do it on the right side, so I picked which side I wanted the facing to be on. The facing will be the side that sits on top of your shoulder, so no one will see that side. So I pressed the sleeve fling, making sure that the seam allowance was pressed towards the side that I wanted the facing to be on, and then understitched the facing, making sure to catch the seam allowance underneath. And then I pressed again and basted it together. Basting is also very necessary for the next step. The basting on the sleeve pieces are necessary because they are needed to create a gather. You need to match up the sleeve on the dots your pattern provides. By the way, this experience has taught me to mark all the dots before you start sewing, because if you try to do it while you're sewing, you have to take in sleeve allowance to make sure everything lines up correctly. So after I pinned the edges where the dots were, I pulled the top to make sure to gather it evenly and pinned it until it matched half of the circumference of the armhole. You're gonna have to do this for every single sleeve piece with the armhole. When it comes to the stitching on the upper part of the sleeve, they changed the wording from base stitch to ease stitch. And that is because with basting, you're dealing with two pieces, but with an ease stitch, you're only dealing with one piece of fabric. So that is why they changed the language, even though you are stitching it in the same exact way with the two rows. For the sleeves, you just bring together the two edges and stitch them together. Make sure to press your seams so that everything lays flat with the main fabric and the liner. So now it's time for the cuffs with the sheer polyester. And this fabric, oh my god, it was so hard to work with. It was such a mistake to replace the organza with this stuff, but I digress. So here is a new term I was not familiar with, and that is a French seam. A French seam is when you stitch a normal seam, but instead of doing it right side to right side, you do it wrong side to wrong side, with the right side being flipped outward. But you also aren't doing this at a regular seam allowance. This pattern wanted me to do it at 1/4. After you make that seam, you trim your seam allowance, then flip it wrong side out, then fold the fabric over the seam, pin it, and stitch it again on the usual seam allowance. And that is a French stitch, keeping in mind that the side with the little flat seam is the wrong side. Then it's time for the gather stitch. I set my machine to a 4, did 2 lines of stitches, remembering to change the machine back to stitching space 1. With the main fabric on the right side, match the seams together and pull on the gather to make it as even as possible with the outer circumference of the sleeve. Make sure you pin the cuff with the frill faced up. And baste the bottom. Then pull over the liner, making sure it is right side to right side. And stitch the bottom of your sleeve. Then pull right side out. Okay, so step 27 has a lot of directions on it. So it's good to take this one step at a time, because sewing on sleeves can be complicated and it's kind of hard to explain what I did. So you turn out the coat wrong side and put the sleeve inside so it's right side to right side together. Pulling on the ease stitch of the main fabric to match the circumference of the armhole, and also making sure to line up the seam. Stitch together, catching the main fabric of the sleeve and the coat. and then you pull out the sleeve so the liner is facing out, something I forgot to do, and then fold over the lining fabric and slip stitch that. This takes a while to do because you have to do the whole entire sleeve. It is a method of covering a seam so one is not seen on the inside. I feel like if you just sewed the arm without doing this step and sewed the liner together in the first step, it would make your shoulders not loose enough for the pull and movement. This did take a while to do. In fact, it took so long that my memory card ran out of space. But hand stitching takes a while. Then it's time for the collar. I actually did this all the way back in step 22 because I did not want to keep switching thread color. For the collar, it's another French seam to sew the two pieces together. I also did not film myself pinning the hem because it took forever with the stupid fabric, and I never want to do that again. The gather was kind of hard for me to line up. I couldn't get a perfectly straight stitch, matching up the seam and the dots. Pulled on the gather, pinned, and sewn. You really couldn't see how uneven it was, so that weirdly worked out. For the back loops, instead of cutting out a tie for the pattern piece that was provided, I used this ribbon from when I made my corset a decade ago in my theater costuming class because it was blue, and mostly because I did not want to try to turn out anything again with that damn needle method. Next, it's time for the buttons, and I had never made buttonholes before, so I was really nervous. I did a bunch of practice rounds that looked like crap, so I just decided to say, screw it, and let's do this. Interfacing piece 2 has the buttonhole lineup on it. So after marking that off, I started to make the buttonholes. Every machine is different on how you do it. I have a Bernadette B33 machine, so I use the knobs to indicate what direction I was going in, and luckily my machine came with a buttonhole foot that helps you measure out the length of your hole, and used a seam ripper to cut them off open. I also had to redo them because the buttons I bought were bigger than what the pattern indicates for, so it turned out fine, I think. So after the grueling task of making the button holes, I lined up the holes to the other side and marked with tailor chalk where the button should be. These are shank buttons, and I went over how to sew on shank buttons in my last video. Also, like I said, if you are wondering about the pocket flap, the picture in the front kind of showed that there was no stitching on that. So I did not want the pocket flaps to just kind of freely hang. So what I did is I ended up going inside the pocket, going through up to the right side of the coat, and then grabbing the wrong side of the pocket flap and going back into the pocket. I went around 3 times, and then like I was sewing on the shank button, that I went back out to the front of the front of the coat, wrapped the thread around 3 times, went back to the bottom, knotted under the stitching 3 more times, and then created a knot. And I did that for every single edge of the pocket just to help keep it down. And because I didn't do a pocket watch, the process is done, and it is time for the reveal of at least the coat. Yay, she's done! At least the coat is done, which I'm pretty sure was the hardest part of this pattern. So as far as grading at least the coat section of this pattern, I would give it a solid B- because they could have made it more helpful. Yes, I know, I understand they're trying to save paper. However, they could have at least put the number of the pattern piece they were referring to on the pictures. Also, some things were a little confusing with the instructions. The language could have been better. I'm still very happy with this piece. I love how it turned out. It actually has a surprising amount of arm movement. Like I can pump it. Yeah. Why did I do that? I was kind of worried about the arm movement because I am a wider shoulder girl with a larger chest. However, I think because the coat doesn't go over my chest, it helps the movement of the arms. And also because of how it wanted you to sew on the liner. I would say this is more of an intermediate pattern where you have a lot of experience with sewing than if you're a beginning sewer. However, if you're a beginning sewer and you want to try and tackle this, watch a lot of videos, ask for a lot of help, and just try to find people who will help you do it. It can be a very complicated process at times. Next, we'll be doing the bodice and then the skirt. Those videos will not be nearly as long. I kind of already looked at the directions for those parts, and let's just say the coat took up a page and a half, where the bodice and the skirt take up that much of how much just one coat took. So I will see you for those videos. I hope you like this steampunk coat that I made. I actually am very proud of myself and how it turned out, despite the amount of how much I was complaining about it. Oh, also side note, she is very toasty, so hopefully when the Ren Fair is finally open again next year, I will go in April, because at least in April in Southern California, it's not 100 degrees. Because in May in California, it sometimes gets up there. All right, I will catch you guys next time. Bye.